Good afternoon or evening, brothers and sisters, and welcome to our safety webinar series for today's segment on what is silica and why is it dangerous? I am BAC International Union Executive Vice President Jerry Sullivan. I am joined today by Lily Calderon, IU Manager of Health and Safety Programs, Dave Wysocki, IMTEF National Safety Director, and Jessica Bunting, the Director of Research to Practice Programs at CPWR. Together, we'll bring you another webinar in our safety series. As you know, silica is in many materials common on construction sites, such as sand, concrete, mortar, block, and bricks, just to name a few. Prior to the issuing of a stronger and more comprehensive silica standard in March of 2016, OSHA estimated that the standard would save approximately 600 lives and prevent 900 cases of silicosis per year. About 2.3 million people in the US are exposed to silica at work. Workers who inhale these very small crystalline silica particles are at increased risk of developing serious silica-related diseases, including silicosis, lung cancer, COPD, and kidney disease. To protect workers exposed to respirable crystalline silica, OSHA has issued two silica standards, one for construction and the other for general industry and maritime. These standards, which BAC was a leader in the fight to urge OSHA to issue the rule, although critically important in protecting workers and a great victory for all, there still remains work that needs to be done to keep workers safe on the job. The key elements in protecting workers are enforcement, education, and training. That's why we are pleased to have Jessica with us today to share her insight and expertise. We all know that BAC is committed to keeping its members safe from all job site hazards, including the exposure to silica. This commitment was just reinforced through the unanimous adoption of Resolution Number 52 by delegates at the BAC 2022 Special Convention last week. This resolution reaffirms BAC's continued leadership on this issue and acknowledges our responsibility to continue to aggressively urge OSHA to effectively enforce its comprehensive silica standard, call on IMI and local training centers to continue to provide training and support for new tools and technology that will minimize the risk of silica exposure, and urge OSHA to regularly update Table 1 of the standard to ensure that the most effective controls are in place to protect workers' safety. With that, to get us started, I'd like to hand it off to Lily Calderon. Lily will cover a few housekeeping items and the introduction of our guest speaker. So I'll turn it to you, Lily.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you. First, thank you to all of you and welcome. As Jerry said, there are many serious hazards out on the job sites, and the more we are aware of them, the better we are at keeping ourselves and our members safe from them. Silica, as Jerry mentioned, is a severe hazard that we may be exposed to every day at job sites. Silica can cause serious health diseases and can be deadly. Understanding what silica is and why it's dangerous can very well help save our lives and others. Here to tell us more on that is Jessica Bunting, the Director of the Research to Practice program at CPWR. Jessica and her team work to encourage widespread adaptation of evidence-based solutions by construction contractors and workers through improving partnerships between researchers and stakeholders, helping stakeholders influence future research, and developing strategies and resources to increase industry awareness and use of safer tools, equipment, and work practices. We thank Jessica for joining us tonight and sharing information and resources. Before I hand it over to Jessica, I would like to know a few housekeeping items. Throughout the presentation, you can use the chat function box to comment or ask questions, or you can write them in the question box, both which are located at the bottom of your screen. We will hold a question and answer session at the end of her presentation. Thank you all, and now I will hand it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Lily and Jerry. And oh, there we go. Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So thank you so much for having me, and good evening, everyone. CPWR has had the pleasure of working with the BAC on research and outreach for many, many years now, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do so once again today. Again, I'm Jess Bunting. I'm the director of CPWR's Research to Practice, or R2P program. And I'm here tonight with my colleague, Rosa Greenberg, who you can also see in the panelist list. She helped put together the presentation, and she's also on the line. She'll be dropping some links in the chat, including a PDF of these slides that I'm going through right now. All right, before we get too far, just a little background for anyone unfamiliar with CPWR. We're the Center for Construction Research and Training, and we're a nonprofit that was originally created by NABTU, the building trades unions, but we operate and are funded separately from them. So we are dedicated to reducing injuries, illnesses, and fatalities in the construction industry. Everything we do relates to construction safety and health. And if you're wondering why our acronym doesn't match our name, it's because we used to be the Center to Protect Workers' Rights. And about 15 or 20 years ago, when we changed our name to better describe our work, we kept the CPWR acronym that we were already known by. So the way that we operate our programs, or I guess we have three main prongs that each has their own funding source. And so we have a research program, a training program, and a service program. I'm going to talk or focus primarily on what's come out of some of our research program today, because my program R2P is part of the research program, which focuses more specifically on identifying, characterizing, and tracking work-related safety and health hazards and risk, and then developing solutions and resources and improving industry awareness of both the hazards and solutions that are available to address them. So just a little bit more on the R2P team, we focus on increasing awareness of hazards and solutions through three main philosophies or areas of research, translation, or developing practical resources, dissemination or finding the best mix of approaches to increase awareness. And then we lean heavily on partnerships, which include working with industry, government, and other partners to conduct better research, create better products, and improve buy-in. So one area that we've worked on really closely with BAC and the International Masonry Institute is Silica for decades now. We've been working to address the silica hazard since long before the OSHA rule came out. And I know that many of you are probably familiar with the hazard already, but I'm going to go over it from the very beginning today. And again, these slides are available, or a PDF of them is available. So, we encourage you to reuse them with members. So what is silica? Often referred to as quartz. It's a very common mineral. It's found in materials that you see all the time, including soil, sand, concrete, rock, landscaping materials. In and of itself, that's not a concern. However, the issue is when microscopic crystalline silica particles get into the air. So this happens when silica-containing materials are cut, ground, grinded, drilled, or otherwise disturbed. And that creates dust that then contains the tiny respirable particles, and it can be breathed in by anyone in the area. This slide includes a more detailed list of materials that may contain silica. I'm not going to review all of them, but later in the presentation, I'll talk about CPWR's Silica Safe website, which gives you access to all of this information and helps you create a written exposure control plan. Examples of extremely common silica-containing materials or products include brick, concrete block, plaster, and various stones and tiles. As you probably know, BAC members are some of the highest risk workers, or as you can probably gather just by what I've covered so far, some of the highest risk workers when it comes to silica exposure. So common activities that members are doing on a daily basis, like cutting, grinding, mixing, sanding, even sweeping and cleaning up, can all create significant amounts of silica dust. Silica, unfortunately, causes permanent lung damage. and it can ultimately lead to death. So I'd like to play a video clip now from Ohio BWC that explains the effects of silica, I think, better than I can. So I'm gonna start this a couple seconds in. Hopefully everyone can.
As the worker breathes, silica crystals flow into his mouth and nose and down the air passages deep into the lungs. The tiny crystals enter the small, fragile air sacs, where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells, called macrophages, engulf and try to dissolve the crystals, but they are unable to. Over time, more and more crystals build up inside the macrophage cells. The macrophages carry the silica into the walls of the lung, where they die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more cells die. This damage can continue even after the exposure to silica stops. Eventually, so much scar tissue forms that the lungs can no longer function. For information on how to protect yourself from silica exposure, visit WorksafeBC.com.
So in addition to other things, what is essentially that video talked about and what silica exposure can lead to is silicosis. This is one of the most serious consequences of breathing in silica dust. It's extremely serious and potentially fatal, and there is no cure. So depending on the amount and duration of exposure, along with other factors, silicosis can take a decade or more to form. That's often the case, but it also might appear in as little as a few weeks of extremely high exposure without the proper protection. So I'd like to share another short video. This is about a bricklayer who developed silicosis after only 5 months of work with inadequate protection. Let me see if I can get out of. Yeah.
I love stonework. I love laying blocks, I like laying bricks. I pretty much love it all. My brother is a welder, I'm also a mason. 2 uncles are masons.
Crystalline silica is one of Earth's most common minerals. It is found in stone, brick, rock, concrete, block, mortar, asphalt, and sand. Using power.
There you go.
It was up in Rome, New York, and we had these big brick buildings, and we had to remove a lot of the damaged brick and replace it with newer brick and cut expansion joints into the building.
If you look at this building, it's just a big red brick apartment building. This is not an unusual material, it's not exotic. It's something that everybody is around, but the people who cut through it or work with it are susceptible to getting disease from it.
I was losing tremendous amount of weight. I was out of breath. It took me a lot of exertion just to do simple tasks.
For this kind of silicosis, there's no medicine that you can give people to make it go away. There's no radiation therapy, there's no chemotherapy, there's no antibiotics. The problem is that the air sacs in the lungs are filled up with this thick material so the air can't get into the body.
We sat down with a surgeon, and the surgeon pretty much told me what the outcome was going to be for the odds of me living and passing with a lung transplant. And I didn't want to put my family through that, because it wasn't very good odds.
We got married in February of 2005. So it was just a month or so after he came home. He did take his oxygen off long enough to get married and then put it right back on.
I guess I thought I was invincible, and something like that taking me down and it being the cause of what I do for a living, that was kind of tough to deal with.
In principle, in theory, prevention of silicosis is very easy because it's simply a matter of keeping the dust out of people's lungs. And the technology to do that is generally low technology. If you know where there's silica present, and if you know there's enough in the air to be harmful, you can reduce the levels in the air by a number of simple things. The simplest may be just pouring water on the tools. So if there's a big drill cutting into rock, if you pour water on the drill, the dust doesn't go up in the air, it stays on the ground.
And I see a lot of people jackhammering with a lot of dust around and no mask.
All right, I'm not gonna share the rest of the video, but you get the picture there. You know, is very serious, and that's just one example of it, you know, really just not taking long to develop. By the time you are having trouble breathing, you're already sick. So it's important to protect workers from the very beginning. There are different types of silicosis. Chronic silicosis usually occurs after 10 or more years of exposure to crystalline silica at relatively low concentrations. That's the first type I mentioned on the previous slide. Accelerated silicosis results from exposure at high concentrations, but develops about 5 to 10 years after the initial exposure. And then acute silicosis occurs when exposure concentrations are the highest. And this is the case where it can cause symptoms to develop within a few weeks to 5 years after the initial exposure. On the right of this slide, you can see images from OSHA of a healthy lung versus one with silicosis. In addition to silicosis, exposure to silica can activate latent tuberculosis. It can increase the risk of developing other serious illnesses such as lung cancer, COPD, renal disease, and autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and scleroderma. So due to the seriousness of the hazard, OSHA ultimately ended up issuing a silica standard for construction in 2016. As you may well know, the standard requires employers to limit worker exposure to silica in addition to implementing other protective measures. So to comply with the standard, employers must follow Table 1 or independently measure worker exposure and identify appropriate controls. What's included in Table 1? OSHA is currently analyzing comments that were submitted to a request for information to determine if revisions to Table 1 may be appropriate, but it currently identifies 18 common tasks with effective dust control methods and required respiratory protection based on various factors. I've included a link on the bottom of this slide to a document that CPWR put together to help contractors comply with Table 1. And we call it our best practices Table 1 tip sheet. I'll talk more about it in a bit, but I did want to include a link here as a reference. The Table 1 tasks are listed on this slide. I'm sure you recognize many popular activities here, regular activities. But let's see, using the second bullet, handheld power saws, as an example, you can see on this slide that the entry in Table 1 would include the engineering and work practice controls that should be implemented, as well as when and what type of respiratory protection is required. So for the handheld power saw, users must use a saw with an integrated water delivery system and operate and maintain the tool in accordance with manufacturer instructions to minimize dust emissions. When used outdoors for fewer than 4 hours, you can see that no respiratory protection is needed, but for any other situation, so either outdoors for more than 4 hours or at any time, any amount of time indoors. Workers must use respiratory protection with an assigned protection factor, or APF, of 10, which essentially means that the concentration of airborne particles coming through the PPE is 1/10 of that in the room. Or put another way, 90% of the airborne particles are blocked from being inhaled. So an N95 respirator has an APF of 10. But again, we don't want to rely solely on PPE. In fact, based on the hierarchy of controls, PPE is a final line of defense. Implementing engineering controls is the most critical means of protection, followed by safe work practices. So this is a simplified hierarchy of controls that OSHA developed for silica exposure. And OSHA states that this pyramid shows their hierarchy of controls, which lists the type of controls in order of effectiveness. You can see the arrow showing decreasing effectiveness as you get down to PPE. So engineering controls are at the top, and they remove or isolate silica dust at the point where it is made. The second most effective type of protection is work practice controls. Work practices involve doing tasks in ways that reduce dust exposure. So that may mean limiting the amount of time spent exposed. It may mean working in a way where surrounding workers are eliminated from the area, so they are just not exposed, rather than trying to work in the vicinity and then having to take them into account, things like that. And then PPE, the least effective, again, type of protection. This is your respirators. And the Silica standard requires employers to use engineering controls and work practices first to reduce exposures. So that's required. And then they can have employees use respirators only if engineering and work practice controls are not sufficient to reduce exposures. It's important to keep in mind that when other controls don't work well enough and the amount of silica dust created by the work exceeds OSHA's permissible exposure limit, the employer is required to have a full written respiratory protection program. That includes fit testing and everything like that. So what are our options for engineering controls? We started to get into it in the video that I was showing, but it's essentially, water or vacuum. One option is water. Water can be used during activities like cutting and sawing, as shown in the picture, but it's also effective at keeping dust down during activities like sweeping or demolition. In both these cases of engineering controls, you can sometimes you can find equipment or tools where the engineering control is built in. Other times you may have to purchase them separately and attach. So the other option is using vacuum methods. Ideally, you can use tools with vacuum attachments so that the dust is being captured right where it starts and before it ever even enters the air. In addition to laying out the types of controls that are required, the Silica standard includes a number of other key provisions. So employers must establish and implement a written exposure control plan that identifies tasks that involve exposure and then the methods used to protect the workers. You must designate a competent person to implement the written exposure control plan. Housekeeping practices have to be restricted if they're exposing workers to silica, such as use of compressed air without a ventilation system to capture the dust and dry sweeping where effective, and safe alternatives are available. Employers must offer medical exams, including chest x-rays and lung function tests every 3 years to workers who are required by the standard to wear a respirator for 30 or more days per year. That would be part of your respiratory protection program. And they must train workers on the health effects of silica exposure, tasks that can expose workers to silica, and ways to limit the exposure. And finally, must keep records of workers' exposure and medical exams. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, CPWR has a site that actually helps you develop this written exposure control plan. It addresses all of those provisions. And this website and planning tool were developed with both contractor and worker input and launched in November 2012. The site includes an about section that explains the site, OSHA's regulations and requirements, what's new in the news. It has a know the hazard section with information on the risk, who's at risk, health effects, and actions that contractors and workers can take to be safe. There's a training and other resources section. What's working has examples of tasks being performed with and without controls, as well as space to share information about successes and challenges. Ask a question has responses to FAQs. It has OSHA's Q&As in English and Spanish, and space to submit a question. And then finally, the best part is the Create a Plan tool that helps contractors comply with the requirement for a written exposure control plan. This slide shows the first step in developing a plan. At the top where the number 1 is, you can see there's an option to register. You do not need to register. Anyone can use the tool. I forgot to mention, this tool is completely free, and actually everything that CPWR produces through our research program is free and publicly available. So Silica is just one topic we work on. That everything that I'm talking about today is completely free and open to use. We don't do anything. If you do create an account, we don't do anything with that information. Registering just gives you the option to confidentially save and update your plans. So we added this feature after launch in response to numerous requests from people using the site. They wanted to be able to save their plans. I think we sometimes look at the total number of people registered and how many plans are created, but other than that, we don't make any attempt to find out who registered or anything like that. There's also a brief explanation of how the tool works, where the number 2 is on this first page. And then if you're ready to start creating the plan, the step 1 or the first question asks you if you'll generate Silica on the job. If you're not sure, the Learn More link at the bottom of the page provides different options and information for finding out. So it opens up the box on the right. With the number 3, there's information about labeling requirements and what to look for on a label, ways to find out, and what to look for on a safety data sheet, and some published data on Silica content of common materials, as well as how to go about having a material's Silica content analyzed if you need to do that. So once you've determined if a material contains silica, you can either select it from the list or fill in one of your own. So I've just sort of filled it out as an example to highlight a couple of things, one of which is that since a job may involve more than one type of material and task, you can select multiple materials and multiple tasks for each one. So you can see here, under concrete, I've selected both drilling and coring and jackhammering. And in addition to concrete, I've selected rock jackhammering. Once you've made these selections, the continue button at the bottom of the screen will turn green and you can move to the next step. So step 1 helps with the standards requirement that the plan has to include a description of the tasks in the workplace that will involve exposure to silica. And then step 2, which was automatically populated with the selections made in step 1, asks how you plan to control the dust for each material task combination. So this step helps with the requirement that the plan include a description of the engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection being used to limit silica exposure. This again has some helpful links where if you're not sure about the engineering controls needed and you need to perform air monitoring, you can click on the click here link and it gives you several options to decide. So option 1 contains the exposure control methods in the new standard and a link to the standard. Option 2 explains how to find a qualified person to perform air monitoring. Option 3 provides access to research, including a link to our new exposure control database that I'll touch on shortly. And option 4 explains how to take advantage of OSHA's on-site consultation program, which is not at all linked to their regulatory or enforcement programs. They're just there to help. Or if you don't need to do that, you can select from the generic equipment control options that are already listed under each material task combination. Or again, you can always enter one of your own. We've tried to make it really easy to identify the 18 options found on table 1 in the standard. And above each list, there's a sentence that reads, "Click here for examples of commercially available equipment and controls." Clicking on that link will take you to examples, including access to manufacturer information on how the equipment control combinations work, videos if they're available, and related research or supporting documentation, including that table 1 tip sheet that I already mentioned. So in this example on the screen, the overhead drill press is part of the solution. So in addition to linking to the manufacturers, there's also a link to information in our solutions database and a related ROI calculation. And then in addition, there's space to enter a description of how the controls will be used to limit exposure on the job. So once the equipment and control methods have been selected, the complete button at the bottom of the screen will turn green, and you can move to step 3. Step 3 is the final step in developing a written exposure control plan. All of the information entered in the last 2 steps automatically appears again under the heading Exposure Assessment and Controls. Those are numbered in red on this screen and circled. And then the rest of step 3 includes space for the other provisions that I talked about, the required items and information that would be helpful to include in your plan. So information about the company, the project, who the competent person is, a link to a description of the competent person's role. There's space to enter information on how access to the work area will be restricted to limit exposure, which is another plan requirement. Space to describe the training that will be provided. The click here option there takes you to training related language in the standard and a direct link to the training resources that are available on this Silica Safe website. And then there's also space to describe housekeeping, medical surveillance, etc. You can complete your plan at any point. So these aren't all, you don't have to fill out all of these, but you should because they're required. You again hit the continue button, and you will be taken to your completed exposure control plan. So this slide shows an example of what that might look like. I just had to break it into 2 images, but it's all on one screen. So you can either print it, email it, download it as a PDF. You can save the plan if you've registered, and you can clear it and start over from here. So with just those 3 steps and at no cost to you, you can create the required exposure control plan. It can easily be updated for new jobs and shared with others. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of other resources linked in the control plan and then also just on the website in general. So that includes the table 1 tip sheet. This is, it includes all the requirements listed on table 1, but then it also includes other terms for the equipment they refer to. It includes photos. It includes the videos that OSHA put out to help with interpretation, manufacturer documents, and input from users on how to implement the controls. Individual entries in the planning tool, I should have mentioned as you go through and are filling it out. Individual entries in the planning tool link to related tip sheets, and then the entire tip sheet document is also available in the training and other resources section. We also have toolbox talks, hazard alert card handout, and trade-specific resources, such as controlling silica for asphalt paving. We have a bunch of different stuff that doesn't really relate to members, but definitely worth going through and checking out what we have for supplemental training resources and handouts. Finally, I wanted to go back to what I mentioned is our new-ish website, the Exposure Control Database. This comes out of our construction solutions team at CPWR, and it is a website that essentially is a database of exposure data for 4 hazards: noise, lead, welding fumes, and silica. So in the case of silica, the goal is to collect data in a central location that contractors who are not following Table 1 can use as objective data and fulfill the exposure assessment requirement in the standard without having to do your own air monitoring or sampling. So the exposure control database is updated as we gather information and data from different sources, including researchers, contractors who are willing to share their sampling data, et cetera. And it can be accessed through either the Silica site or directly at the link on this slide. And I will say, again, we're always adding to it and it gets better the more information and data we have. So if you have air monitoring data, or if you know of an employer that is conducting air monitoring and willing to share the data, please, I encourage them to reach out to Sarah Brooks at this email address. She's the industrial hygienist in charge of this project, and all information shared will be used anonymously without any company identifiers. Right, and with that, I'll wrap up, and I believe we're opening the floor for questions. My contact information is here, and I think Lily also had it on the main slides as well. So please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Jess.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, for that great presentation. You gave us some critically important and informative information. So let's get started with the question and answer portion of the webinar. So if you haven't already, you can submit questions. Any questions that you may have for Jessica or the panel by using the question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen. Lily will be leading the question and answer session, so let me turn it back over to her now.
Thank you, Jerry. Patrick, can we go to the next slide, please? Before we get ahead with our Q&A, I just want to let everyone know that we do have an upcoming webinar scheduled for December 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be discussing OSHA updates. We'll look at 2022, what OSHA has done and what it plans on doing for 2023 and so forth. Please join us. Link will be shared in the next week or so you can sign up and register. Thanks. Next slide, please. And again, like Jessica said, we'll open up for Q&A. If you would like to contact any one of us, Dave, Jessica, myself, please feel free. And I'll start with a couple questions. We have, how does the employer qualify the competent person for the Silica standard? Is there any specific training they need?
I will. Yeah, I'll take that one, Lily. So the standard for Silica does not specify any particular training requirements by the employer for competent persons. What it does do, it defines the competent person in terms of their capabilities, whether the competent person has the knowledge and ability to perform what the standard says, and the employer has to make sure that the competent person, obviously gives them the authority to perform those duties.
Thanks, Dave. I got another one here. If I am wearing an N95 type mask. Do I need to be fit tested?
Yeah, I can jump in there and say that yes, that's considered a respirator, and you should be fit tested. And Patrick, do we think everyone's getting the chats now? I think I can send a chat to everyone. I'm going to try to drop a couple.
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay. NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, has some good information about fit testing, because there are a couple different types of fit testing, including qualitative and quantitative, which is essentially the difference between just a pass-fail test versus using an instrument to numerically measure the effectiveness of the respirator. And that obviously is going to take someone with some skill to do. So here is a link to more information about that. And actually, I'm going to drop a second link in, which is just about selecting respiratory protection in general, also from NIOSH.
Thank you. I guess going back to masks, the N95s or just a respirator, how do you know when you're properly wearing it?
Dave might have some good tips, but again, that gets back to the fit testing. And I think that's sort of like part of the fit testing, and is, making sure that you know how to wear it correctly. So it creates a seal. And again, you can't always just trust the fit and how it feels. That gives you some clue as to whether or not it's working, but it's not an effective means in really testing it.
I'll also touch on that. Yeah, the manufacturer in the box will have fit test instructions on how to fit test their respirator. And like Jessica said, just because you have it on doesn't mean that it's proper. Some you could actually taste the dust, or maybe you're doing it for 5-10 minutes. You take your mask off, and you have little white particles under each side of your nose. But yeah, just following the manufacturer's instructions on how that one particular one you're using needs to be fit tested.
So going on that, Dave, should you be trained on how to use a respirator?
Absolutely. Anybody that's going to don or doff a respirator has to be trained, not just donning and doffing, but actually cleaning and taking care of it. And like I say, it all depends on the manufacturer. The employer has to train to the piece of PPE that they are giving you. But yes, you should be trained. And you should have a respiratory protection plan in place.
Correct. Thank you. I have one more. Is all the information, resources that you shared today available in any other language?
Yes, good question. We try to put out as much as we can in both English and Spanish. So, hold on. I want to double check before I say this. I know the resources are available in Spanish, the toolbox talks, the hazard alert card, all of that stuff. I am not sure that the planning tool is available in Spanish. I believe that's English only.
Okay. So I've been told while the building is under construction and walls may not be up yet, providing an open level to air and wind is still considered inside the building, so wearing masks would still be the rule to being inside. Would this be correct, or could it be considered outside since the elements of outside pertain?
I'm just rereading it just to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, Dave, I don't know if there's a formula, but I think it's an enclosed space. It's a covered,
right,
partially enclosed space.
Correct. And that's going to go back to the general contractor. The general contractor or the employer might require you to wear a mask if there's any exposure to silica just to better protect us.
We have another, is there a standard that requires signage when silica is present, even if it's under the PLL limits?
I don't believe that signage is required, but the training on silica hazards is required if it's present. So you should be at least making workers aware of possible exposure and how to prevent it, whether that's through hands-on training, posters for reinforcement, signage and stuff like that would be optional, I think.
I think so too. What suggestions do you have for a young worker dealing with other workers who do not take the dangers of silica seriously?
My suggestion would be to contact the job site you're on, whoever, your foreman, whether you have a superintendent that you can talk to, a steward on the job, because this is, just by Jessica's presentation, silica is a very serious health hazard, and every member should be taking it seriously. But I would start with your steward, go to your foreman, superintendent, or even call your BAs out and get them involved.
I think also just if you have the opportunity to just share something like the video that I showed you guys about somebody who's experienced it, something like that, I think testimonials sometimes can make an impact when somebody thinks it can't happen to them.
Absolutely. I think that is, sharing a story kind of hits home to a lot of people, and hopefully sharing a video like that would be one way to, deal with a younger worker who doesn't really know what silica is and what it will do to them years to come, right?
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions, Jerry.
Yeah, Lily, there's one more. How effective is using air scrubbers on the job?
I see it now.
I do not have an answer for that, but I can try to follow up with more information. I think others at CPWR might have an answer.
Yeah, I don't have an answer either. We can follow up.
Yeah, Jordan, you can email me directly, or I can get your contact information from Lily and follow up.
I think that's all there, Jerry.
Yeah, well, I'm not seeing any further questions, so we will wrap up today's webinar. We want to thank Jessica Bunting and CPWR for the incredibly important presentation on silica safety. We hope you found the webinar informative. We believe there was lots of useful information, key points, facts to make us aware of the dangers that are present from the exposure to silica dust, along with helpful recommendations on tools, technology, and PPE that will reduce the risk of exposure. So the International Union appreciates your participation today. Feel free to reach out to Jessica Bunting, Dave, or Lily and I for additional information. Before I close, again, I'd like to thank Jessica and ask if Jessica, Lily, or Dave have any other closing thoughts or comments or remarks they'd like to make.
I would just like to say thank you for participating. I know we've had a couple of webinars throughout the year on safety, and we will continue to have them throughout the year and in the next year. And please share if you think that we should focus on a topic. Please contact me, and we will try to, put a webinar on so that your concern might not be just yours. It might be many others. So again, thank you for your participation, your continued participation. And if you would like a link to the recording, please contact me. I can get that for you. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for having me for the opportunity, and remind everyone that, like the doctor in the video said, silica exposure is preventable, and together we can make a difference here.
For sure.
Thank you.
No, I just want to touch on what Lily said. Yeah, if there's anyone on this call that if there's a specific hazard that you're dealing with that you'd like to hear more information on, definitely reach out to myself, Lily, or Jerry, and we will definitely put something together, because we're not out in the field every day like you guys are, you know, and there's different hazards that you guys are using out there that we may not hear about for a little while. So, but thank you, Jess. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Lily. Great presentation.
Okay, with that, I'd like to say thank you to Jessica again for the great presentation. We really appreciate you being with us, and to Lily and Dave as well. And thank you all for participating, and please stay safe.